1991, over the flat gray skies of western Iraq, a MiG-25 Foxbat pilot from the Iraqi Air Force is executing a textbook high-speed intercept. Altitude 60,000 feet, speed Mach 2.2. His radar screen is empty. Only ground clutter and minor returns from a friendly convoy. No contacts. But the AWACS controller is panicked. "Break right, defensive." The pilot blinks. There's nothing there. No radar lock. No missile warning. And then suddenly the cockpit flashes white. The MiG disintegrates in midair, hit by an AM-7 Sparrow launched 50 miles away by a U.S. Air Force F-15C Eagle. The Eagle pilot never saw the Foxbat with his eyes. He didn't need to. The AN/APG-63 radar had tracked, locked, and launched, all before the MiG even knew it was being hunted. And it wasn't the first time. By the third day of Operation Desert Storm, American F-15s had shot down over a dozen Iraqi aircraft, MiG-29s, MiG-25s, even Mirage F-1s, without taking a single loss. Some were destroyed before ever crossing into engagement range. Others never got a lock. Many never even realized they'd been targeted until the sky lit up around them. From inside Baghdad's Air Defense Coordination Center, Soviet advisors watched the radar feeds. They weren't just confused, they were stunned. This was not the kind of aerial warfare they had trained for. Not in Vietnam, not in the Arab-Israeli conflicts, not in the simulations they had run for 2 decades. They had built MiGs to match American jets in dogfights. They had trained pilots for turning battles in cannon bursts. But this was different. This was war from beyond sight. An American aircraft flying alone with no ground control had located, locked, fired, and killed a Soviet-designed fighter jet before it even knew there was a threat. The data didn't lie. The radar logs confirmed it. The missile logs confirmed it. The wreckage confirmed it. What they were seeing was not just the death of one MiG. It was the death of parity. The myth of symmetric air combat, broken at 40,000 feet with a silent lock and a radar-guided missile. And in the halls of Soviet military aviation, panic was beginning to bloom. In the decades leading up to Desert Storm, Soviet air doctrine rested on a foundation of speed, numbers, and control. Their engineers built interceptors that could outclimb and outrun their American counterparts. Their generals designed vast, layered air defense networks to detect, vector, and destroy incoming threats. And their pilots trained under the assumption that air combat would be fought, as it had been in the past, in sight, in range, and in combat. The MiG-21 had earned its stripes over Vietnam, trading blows with American Phantoms in dogfights that felt equal. The MiG-23 promised to close the gap with variable sweep wings and better speed. The MiG-25, one of the fastest operational aircraft ever built, was developed explicitly to counter the threat of high-flying American bombers and recon planes. Each of these aircraft had been designed with a single shared assumption, that air combat was visual combat. Kill the radar, close the distance, turn and fire. That was the formula. But the Americans weren't playing by that formula anymore. What Soviet planners had failed to grasp, what their intelligence agencies had missed, was the transformation happening quietly inside the U.S. Air Force during the 1970s. The F-15 wasn't just another fighter. It was the first platform built from the ground up for beyond visual range, BVR combat. The Soviets had known about BVR. Their own interceptors carried radar-guided missiles like the R-23 and later R-27. But these systems were unreliable, their radars weak, and their doctrine reluctant to cede control to individual pilots. BVR engagements were risky. Pilots often waited for visual ID. Orders from ground controllers were required. The command hierarchy took precedence over pilot initiative. In contrast, the F-15's design was predicated on autonomy. Its AN/APG-63 radar allowed pilots to independently detect and track multiple targets at distances exceeding 100 miles. Its HUD integrated radar lock, speed, and altitude into one seamless system. The AIM-7 Sparrow and later AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles gave it teeth to reach out and destroy targets long before they could see the Eagle coming. And perhaps most critically, American pilots were trained to fire first. Rules of engagement increasingly favored radar identification. There was no need to see the enemy to kill him. To the Soviets, this was heresy. To the Americans, it was evolution. But in the conference rooms of Soviet air doctrine centers, in Zhukovsky, in Frunze, in the Ministry of Defense, the assumptions held firm. They believed MiG-25s would blind F-15s with speed, that MiG-29s would win in turn fights, that quantity, speed, and surprise would level the playing field. They had no idea that the playing field had shifted 20 miles to the east, and 100 seconds earlier. And that's how, when the first MiGs vanished from radar screens with no warning, no counter, and no return fire, Soviet engineers didn't think they had been outflown. They thought something had broken. But it hadn't broken. It had just been replaced. To understand the scale of the failure, you have to start with what the Soviets believed air combat was supposed to look like. Their doctrine was shaped in the 1950s and refined through proxy wars across Vietnam, the Middle East, and Central Asia. The central idea was simple: centralized control. Pilots were not hunters. They were weapons directed by radar. Ground-based stations, equipped with powerful P-14 Tall King or P-18 Spoon Rest radar systems, scanned the skies, acquired targets, and assigned interceptors. Once vectored toward enemy aircraft, Soviet fighters used onboard radar only in the final seconds of engagement, often relying on visual ID for missile launch. The logic was bureaucratic. Centralized radar meant fewer misidentifications, and rigid control meant fewer rogue pilots making deadly mistakes. To Soviet leadership, the battlefield in the sky wasn't dynamic. It was choreographed. But the United States, emerging from Vietnam's chaos, came to the opposite conclusion. American pilots, burned by radar confusion and close-range losses, needed freedom, autonomy to detect, assess, and engage without waiting for orders. So, when the F-15 program was initiated in the late 1960s, the core requirement wasn't speed or maneuverability, it was situational dominance, and that began with radar. The AN/APG-63 was revolutionary. It wasn't just more powerful than Soviet equivalents, it was programmable. It could prioritize threats, adjust scan patterns mid-flight, and maintain multiple target tracks even during aggressive maneuvers. While Soviet radars were analog and linear, the F-15 system was digital and modular. It meant one thing above all: F-15 pilots saw the enemy first, and they didn't need permission to fire. Soviet engineers had never fully accounted for this. They modeled U.S. jets based on F-4 Phantoms, heavy, underpowered, and radar-limited. Their intercept strategies were designed to exploit American dependence on ground guidance. But the F-15 shattered that dynamic. Instead of chasing threats, it waited for them. Instead of being detected, it detected first. And when MiGs came climbing in to intercept at Mach 2, they were often met with AIM-7 Sparrows or AIM-120 AMRAAMs already on the way. This rendered Soviet dogfighting doctrine, designed for speed and turn radius, largely irrelevant. A MiG-25 couldn't dodge what it never saw coming. A MiG-23 couldn't turn into a missile fired from 30 miles away. In response, Soviet command doubled down. They pushed for more aggressive intercept profiles, tighter ground control, new jamming techniques, but the foundation itself, the assumption that wars in the sky would be fought within view, was beginning to collapse. And that collapse wasn't theoretical. It was already happening. In the Bekaa Valley, in the Persian Gulf, in the open skies above the desert. The F-15 wasn't winning with luck. It was winning with information. And Soviet air doctrine, built for another era, was about to pay the price. June 9, 1982. Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. The Israeli Air Force had launched Operation Mole Cricket 19, a massive air campaign to dismantle Syrian air defenses and secure air superiority over the eastern Mediterranean. On paper, the skies should have turned into a battlefield of attrition. The Syrian Arab Air Force, advised and equipped by the Soviets, deployed over 100 MiG-21s and MiG-23s, backed by an extensive SAM network. Instead, it became a one-sided massacre. The Israeli F-15s and F-16s, flying under the command of pilots trained in BVR engagement doctrine and equipped with American-built electronics, tore through Syrian formations with surgical precision. Over 80 Syrian aircraft were shot down in the span of days. Israeli losses, 0. From Soviet listening posts in Syria, the signals were clear. The MiGs weren't even getting close. Pilots were being killed without ever identifying their targets. Ground control struggled to keep up. Radar locks failed to translate into actionable data. Missiles missed wildly or never launched at all. It was the first time Soviet advisors watched their air combat doctrine collapse in real time. They couldn't explain it. Syria's aircraft were equipped with radar. Their missile stocks were fresh. The training had been extensive, and yet time and again the MiGs vanished from radar, only to reappear moments later as burning debris tumbling from the sky. In Moscow, the early explanations were predictable. Electronic deception. American AWACS manipulation. Israeli airframe enhancements not representative of baseline U.S. platforms. But the evidence didn't support that narrative. Yes, the Israelis were skilled, but the F-15 itself was the problem. Pilots were using its radar to lock targets at 50 to 60 miles, firing from well beyond Soviet missile ranges, evading incoming threats not with speed but with data. They knew exactly where the enemy was, and they knew when to strike. This wasn't a dogfight. This was a hunt. For Soviet engineers, the lesson should have been clear. The old assumptions about visual range, about radar parity, about missile effectiveness no longer held. A new kind of air war had arrived. But instead of adapting, the Soviet military-industrial complex doubled down. MiG designs focused on speed and agility. New models promised improved radar and missile capability, but none matched the total sensor fusion of the F-15 system. In truth, the impossible event in Lebanon wasn't a fluke. It was a preview, and the Soviet Union missed its chance to understand it, which meant when the next conflict came, over the deserts of Iraq, it wasn't going to be a learning experience. It was going to be a reckoning. The reports from Lebanon were clear, brutal, and deeply inconvenient. 80 Syrian MiGs destroyed. 0 Israeli jets lost. Radar logs showed the F-15s engaging at distances far beyond the capabilities of MiG-23s. In some cases, Syrian pilots had no radar lock before being hit. Ground controllers in Damascus transmitted emergency vectors, but even those were lagging behind the pace of the engagements. To the Soviet General Staff, it didn't make sense. And so, it couldn't be real. In late 1982, a special internal review was convened at the Gromov Flight Research Institute near Moscow. Engineers, air defense officers, and doctrine analysts pored over the combat tapes retrieved from Syrian and Soviet radar stations. MiG telemetry, missile launch data, even audio recordings from downed pilots were reviewed. The conclusion? No conclusion. They couldn't explain it. MiG-21s and MiG-23s had been wiped out, and the tapes didn't show any of the classical indicators of successful air combat. No dogfights, no visible intercept attempts, just abrupt cutoffs in communication. Radar locks disappearing mid-climb, pilots reporting clean skies one moment and fireballs the next. For senior Soviet officers who had spent their careers designing symmetrical strategies, the implications were intolerable. So they created another theory. They decided the Israeli F-15s were not operating alone. They claimed U.S. AWACS aircraft had provided hidden targeting data, and that Syrian losses were due to jamming and spoofing. The F-15s, they insisted, were merely delivery platforms, blind without foreign radar support. This explanation was comforting. It allowed the Soviet system to remain intact. Their fighters weren't obsolete. Their doctrine wasn't broken. The Americans had cheated. But that wasn't the truth. Declassified NATO logs later showed multiple Israeli F-15 kills occurred without AWACS support. In fact, the F-15's onboard radar and pilot autonomy had outperformed even what U.S. engineers expected. The aircraft had made its kills solo. Still, Moscow refused to update its doctrine. Soviet aircraft continued to prioritize close-range combat ability. Radar systems were upgraded incrementally, but the foundational belief remained. BVR was unreliable, risky, and prone to failure. Meanwhile, the Americans were perfecting it. They integrated helmet-mounted sights, refined HUD symbology, practiced radar locks under jamming conditions. F-15 squadrons trained for high-speed first-look kills without ever seeing their targets. By 1985, F-15 pilots no longer worried about MiGs. They practiced against each other because nothing else in the sky could match them. And back in Moscow, the truth was being buried under denial. But denial wouldn't save them. Because in a few short years, their jets would face F-15s again, this time over the Persian Gulf. And the skies over Iraq would not be kind. By 1984, as the Cold War entered its twilight years, a dangerous theory had taken root inside Soviet Air Command. If the Americans were winning dogfights without ever seeing their opponents, if their jets could kill before Soviet fighters even got a lock, then the solution was clear: outrun them. The answer, Soviet engineers believed, was in speed, not radar, not software, not pilot training, just raw velocity. Enter the MiG-25 and its younger cousin, the MiG-31, interceptors capable of Mach 2.8, capable of climbing to 70,000 feet, and armed with long-range R-33 missiles. The thinking was simple. The F-15 might have radar reach, but Soviet interceptors would beat them to altitude, strike faster, and retreat before retaliation. It was elegant in theory. It failed in reality. In practice, high-speed interceptors carried outdated radar systems, still analog, still narrow-beam, and easily confused by jamming or maneuvering targets. Even the R-33 missile, with its impressive paper range, suffered from unreliable tracking when launched under real-world engagement conditions. And most critically, speed couldn't compensate for sensor lag. The F-15, thanks to its AN/APG-63 radar and digital fire control system, could scan, lock, and fire in seconds. MiG pilots, by contrast, often had to rely on ground control vectors just to know where to point their noses. By the time they got into missile range, they were already targets, and often already too late. Still, Soviet officers clung to the new theory. Exercises were redesigned to favor vertical climbs and hit-and-run slashing attacks. Interceptor regiments trained to fire missiles from extreme range, then break off before entering the F-15's radar envelope. But there was a fatal flaw. The F-15's radar envelope was larger than anything they anticipated. The Americans had built a jet not just to fire far, but to see farther. Track-while-scan capabilities meant F-15 pilots could identify and prioritize multiple targets while still maneuvering aggressively. They weren't looking for a close-range brawl. They were coordinating a mathematical kill chain, backed by radar memory, missile guidance, and pilot autonomy. MiG-25s flying at Mach 2.5 were fast, but they were flying blind. The wrong theory, the belief that speed alone could substitute for sensor fusion, had now infected doctrine. Procurement decisions were based on it. Pilot tactics were redesigned around it. And worst of all, it allowed Soviet command to keep ignoring the real problem. That their pilots were flying into battle with half the information. They could move faster, but they couldn't see farther. And when missiles were launched at 40 miles instead of 4, that difference was fatal. It was the wrong theory, and it was about to meet the right enemy. If speed alone couldn't save the MiGs, then Soviet command pivoted to a second, equally flawed theory. They believed the Americans couldn't win without AWACS. Airborne warning and control systems, high-flying radar aircraft like the E-3 Sentry, had become a centerpiece of U.S. air power. Soviet analysts observed that American fighters often operated in coordination with these radar platforms. So they assumed the F-15 was dependent on that external eye. Cut off the AWACS, they thought, and the eagle would be blind. The strategy shifted. Exercises began to emphasize saturation tactics, overwhelming American radar coverage with multiple squadrons from different angles. New jamming pods were issued to frontline MiG-29s and Su-24s. Anti-radiation missiles were developed to home in on E-3 radar emissions. The idea was to create chaos in the sky, to sever the kill chain by eliminating or isolating the AWACS link. But once again, they misunderstood the system. The F-15 didn't need AWACS to see. Its AN/APG-63 radar was designed from the start to be a self-contained hunter. With track-while scan, high-resolution target discrimination, and rapid refresh rates, the radar could identify, prioritize, and fire on enemy aircraft with no external support. In simulated red flag exercises, American F-15 pilots routinely trained without AWACS. They were drilled in solo interception, practiced radar silent kills, and engaged in no communication scenarios where autonomy was the mission standard. The true purpose of the AWACS wasn't to feed targets to the F-15. It was to manage the battle space, to coordinate multiple flights across a fluid battlefield. The kill itself? That was all Eagle. The second theory collapsed for the first time over the Persian Gulf. During a key engagement in January 1991, a pair of Iraqi MiG-29s attempted to flank U.S. F-15Cs believed to be relying on AWACS for targeting. The Iraqi pilots broke radar silence, climbed above cloud cover, and prepared for a head-on missile exchange. But the F-15s were already tracking them, on their own. No AWACS input, no third-party radar. 2 AIM-7s were fired from beyond visual range. Both MiGs were destroyed. The Eagles never changed altitude. Soviet observers were stunned. Their theory had failed again. They had thought the F-15 was powerful because of external support. They didn't understand that its power was internal, designed into every wire, every line of code, every piece of combat doctrine. And because they refused to accept that, they kept fighting the wrong war. They jammed the wrong frequencies. They deployed fighters in the wrong formations. They targeted the AWACS when they should have been afraid of what was hunting in front of it. The second wrong theory was more than a tactical miscalculation. It was a strategic illusion, and it was blinding the very engineers responsible for defending the Soviet Union's skies. For over a decade, Soviet military intelligence had collected data on the F-15. They had specs from open-source Western journals, telemetry estimates from radar tracking, limited visual observations from air shows and brief encounters over Japan, the Korean DMZ, and Alaska. They believed they understood it. But what they missed, what every file in the GRU archive failed to capture, was the system behind the aircraft. The F-15 was not just a machine. It was the physical embodiment of a doctrine shift the Soviets never saw coming. In their assessments, the GRU rated the F-15 as a high-performance air superiority fighter with powerful radar and medium-range missiles. But every intelligence report underestimated its combat fusion. They measured speed, turn radius, climb rate. What they didn't measure, because they had no framework to understand it, was pilot autonomy powered by machine intelligence. The AN/APG-63 radar was listed in Soviet documents as having 80 kilometers detection range. The real figure was well over 160 kilometers under ideal conditions. They believed the Sparrow missile needed clear lock-on before launch. In reality, it could be launched in track-while scan mode, guided mid-flight, and switched to terminal homing, all without visual contact. They also assumed American pilots required constant ground control input. In reality, they were trained to fight solo, making snap decisions with support, not dependence. This gap in understanding became fatal over Iraq. Soviet-trained Iraqi pilots entered combat expecting parity. MiG-29s were supposed to match F-15s. But they found themselves destroyed by missiles they never saw, fired by aircraft they never spotted. The GRU's failure wasn't just technical. It was philosophical. Their worldview couldn't compute a machine like the F-15 because it had no direct analog in Soviet doctrine. Soviet fighters were designed to be pieces in a command puzzle. The F-15 was a self-contained predator. American design teams had fused radar, weapons, and cockpit into a single kill platform, one where the pilot didn't wait for commands. He hunted, decided, fired. Soviet assessments missed this completely. Captured Iraqi officers, interrogated after the war, revealed the terror. We never saw the Americans, just explosions. One air controller described watching 2 radar tracks vanish mid-transmission. We thought it was jamming. Then we found the wreckage. The failure was comprehensive, in training, in prediction, in doctrine, but worst of all, in belief. The Soviets had convinced themselves that the F-15 was just another jet. They had the numbers, the missile counts, the speeds, but what they didn't have was understanding. And when the missiles began to fall in the desert sky, no amount of firepower or theory could shield them from that truth. To understand why the F-15 didn't just win battles, but redefined them, you have to dissect not just the jet, but the system it carried into the sky. The F-15 Eagle was born from the failures of Vietnam. American jets had lost too many fights to smaller, more agile MiGs. Air combat had become a chaotic mix of close-range dogfights and unreliable missile locks. The U.S. needed a reset, not just a better aircraft, but a new philosophy of engagement. So the designers at McDonnell Douglas did something radical. They built an aircraft around the concept of first look, first lock, first kill. Everything else, speed, agility, armament, was secondary to that holy trinity. At the heart of the system was the AN/APG-63 radar. Unlike Soviet radars, which operated in linear preset modes, the APG-63 was fully programmable and pulse Doppler capable. It could filter out ground clutter, track targets flying at any altitude, switch between search and lock modes seamlessly, and most critically, it could follow multiple targets at once, a capability no MiG radar of the era could match. This wasn't just a technical leap, it was a cognitive one. In training, U.S. F-15 pilots learned to use radar not as a backup, but as their primary sense. No more waiting for visual confirmation. No more looping dogfights. If the radar saw it and the missile could reach it, the pilot engaged. The second pillar of the system was weapon integration. The F-15 carried AM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles, AM-9 Sidewinders for close-range heat-seeking, and later, the AIM-120 AMRAAM, the first true fire-and-forget BVR missile in American service. These weapons weren't bolted on. They were digitally tied to the radar and HUD. The pilot didn't toggle between weapons like a Cold War gunner. He received real-time symbology, range, closure speed, radar confirmation, all layered in his line of sight. Everything the jet knew, the pilot knew. That feedback loop was decisive. While Soviet MiG pilots juggled analog switches and voice commands from ground controllers, F-15 pilots were reading radar locks on their HUD, receiving audible tone cues for missile solutions, and firing without ever seeing the enemy. Then came the final layer. Tactical autonomy. American doctrine empowered pilots to make real-time engagement decisions. In a furball, an Eagle pilot didn't call for permission. He executed. Red flag exercises reinforced this aggressively. Pilots trained against the best in live combat simulations, often flying against other F-15s, the only real threat they had left. The combined result? An airframe that was fast, maneuverable, and could carry over 16,000 pounds of ordnance, but never needed to get close to kill. In Desert Storm, this system performed exactly as intended. Eagles routinely launched missiles at ranges of 30 to 50 miles, often killing before Iraqi MiG pilots even received a radar warning. American F-15Cs downed 36 Iraqi aircraft during the war. Not one was lost in return. One engagement saw a U.S. pilot lock onto a MiG-29 using the APG-63's track-while scan mode, fire an AIM-7 from 40 miles and break off. Seconds later, the Iraqi aircraft exploded. The F-15 was already turning for the next kill. This was not dogfighting. This was networked execution. a fusion of human decision-making, machine guidance, and system-level synchronization. Soviet engineers had tried to match each piece: better radar, faster missiles, more Gs in a turn. But what they lacked was integration. Their jets were fast. Their missiles were deadly. But they never became a system. The F-15 did. And that changed the sky forever. January 19th, 1991. The Persian Gulf War was 4 days old. 2 U.S. Air Force F-15C Eagles patrolled the night sky east of Baghdad, maintaining a racetrack orbit at 30,000 feet. Their AN/APG-63 radars scanned the darkness, track while scan mode active. 30 miles away, 2 Iraqi MiG-29 Fulcrums lifted off, vectoring west. The MiGs never saw them. Within seconds, both American pilots had target locks. AM-7 missiles streaked into the night. Iraqi radar logs went dark. There were no evasive turns, no counter-missiles, just silence, then fireballs in the distance. In that one engagement, the entire Soviet promise of parity in the air died. And the worst part? The Iraqis had never even fired. Across the war, it happened again and again. January 26th. 2 more MiG-29s destroyed by F-15s over southern Iraq. February 7th. A Foxbat destroyed mid-climb at Mach 2 by a radar lock 40 miles away. February 14th. 4 MiG-23s vectored toward a strike package. Only one turned back. The rest disintegrated in mid-air, killed by eagles they never visually identified. In total, U.S. Propam. Now F-15C scored 36 confirmed air-to-air kills during Desert Storm, 0 losses. Not one eagle was shot down, not by missile, not by cannon, not even scratched. The Soviet-designed aircraft, MiG-25s, MiG-29s, MiG-23s, were reduced to blips on a screen. Their pilots flew into the kill zone, blind and trusting the radar picture they were trained to follow. But they were flying toward ghosts. One Iraqi pilot interviewed years later described the horror. There was no enemy. The radar was clean. Then I heard a tone. Then, nothing. For Soviet engineers watching from Baghdad's command centers or reviewing the feeds in Moscow, the humiliation was absolute. These MiGs were supposed to be survivable, fast, lethal. They had received Soviet training, Soviet upgrades, Soviet tactics, and still they were being erased. The myth that Soviet fighters could match American air power, destroyed in full daylight. And the worst insult, they never even got to fight. In one of the most damning after-action reviews, a Soviet air defense officer wrote, "We designed our fighters for combat. The Americans removed the combat entirely." In the post-war analysis, it became clear the F-15 hadn't won with luck or surprise. It had dominated because of its design. It was built not to outmaneuver, but to outsee, outthink, and outshoot. Every Soviet plan, from the MiG-25 speed to the MiG-29's agility, was rendered meaningless. The Eagles didn't play by those rules. They never entered that fight. They operated in a different dimension of air warfare. That's what made it humiliating. Not that the F-15 was better in a fight, but that it never gave the MiG a chance to fight at all. When the dust settled in 1991, the statistics were undeniable. Iraqi forces, armed with Soviet jets, trained in Soviet doctrine, supported by Soviet engineers, had suffered a catastrophic defeat in the air. Every engagement with US F-15s had ended in one outcome: loss. But the true damage went beyond aircraft counts. The F-15 hadn't just killed MiGs. It had shattered the Soviet air doctrine that had guided the USSR for nearly 4 decades. Soviet ideology had clung to a belief in symmetry, that each U.S. platform would be met with a corresponding Soviet one. That for every F-4 there was a MiG-21. For every F-16, a MiG-29. For every AWACS, a ground-controlled intercept team with radar vans and overlapping coverage. But the Americans had broken from that mold. The F-15 wasn't built to match its opponents. It was built to eliminate the concept of a fair fight. In doing so, it exposed every Soviet weakness, not just in hardware, but in thinking. The MiG-25's speed? Irrelevant when the pilot had no situational awareness. The MiG-29's agility? Pointless when missiles arrived from beyond visual range. The centralized command system? Fatally slow in an environment where decisions had to be made in seconds, not minutes. Worse still, Soviet generals now faced a hard truth. Their entire air defense ecosystem, radars, interceptors, SAMs, was built on the assumption that war would happen at a known distance, under known conditions. The F-15 tore that assumption apart. And so the collapse wasn't just strategic, it was ideological. It signaled the end of the belief that sheer numbers, brute speed, or even pilot bravery could overcome a technologically superior adversary. In response, Soviet planners rushed to propose upgrades, new radars, advanced missiles, better training protocols. But the truth was already written into the wreckage scattered across Iraqi deserts. They had lost the future of air combat before it even began. And while the USSR itself would dissolve before they could act, the wound left by the F-15's dominance would never fully heal. It proved with brutal clarity that the next war in the sky would not be won by the best dogfighter. It would be won before the enemy even knew they were in a fight. Today, the F-15 still flies. More than 50 years after its first flight in 1972, the Eagle remains the only air superiority fighter in the world with a perfect combat record. Over 100 kills. 0 losses in air-to-air combat. No Soviet-designed jet ever beat it in battle. The Cold War ended. The USSR collapsed. But the shadow of the F-15 never left. In modern Russia, next-generation fighters like the Su-35 and Su-57 are often hailed as the successors to Soviet air power. But even they carry a quiet acknowledgement. Their designs now emphasize radar strength, BVR missile capability, and pilot autonomy, concepts once dismissed as Western indulgences. They are, in a sense, an admission that the Americans were right. The F-15 was never about showmanship. It didn't need stealth. It didn't need hype. It just needed information dominance, delivered through powerful radar, integrated systems, and a pilot trained to make the kill before the enemy even realized they were in danger. That's why it haunts the Cold War's legacy. Because unlike the MiG-25s that sit in museums, the F-15 is still operational. It's been upgraded, refined, and modernized. But its mission remains the same. Win the sky. No dogfights. No fair fights. Just first look, first lock, first kill. And that ghost still echoes in every hangar where a MiG once stood. In every radar screen that suddenly went blank. In every pilot's final transmission that ended not with a scream, but with static. Because when the Soviets watched their best fighters vanish without warning, without glory, they weren't just witnessing defeat. They were witnessing the future, and it flew on eagle wings.